Well, short-term rental companies Airbnb and Expedia have supported a move to an extent to add a tourism levy as part of a New South Wales government review into short-term rental accommodation. The companies accept that their guests should pay the tax, but believe it should also be applied to all tourism accommodation like hotels. The booking surcharge is being considered by the state government to encourage more residential leases and helping address the housing crisis. Let's go live now to Airbnb Australia and New Zealand's Head of Public Policy, Michael Crosby. Michael, thanks so much for your time. So give us your position.
So Airbnb has put forward a submission through the New South Wales government's current inquiry into the existing rules that oversee the short-term rental sector. Airbnb does support tourism levies for the sector. We have worked with governments around the world to collect and remit about $10 billion worth of taxes globally to governments around the world. We think that a levy in New South Wales could work quite well. We have said that it would be ideally used, the revenue could be ideally used for contributions towards social housing projects. We have been working with the Victorian government for a little while now around their levy arrangements, and one thing that we have suggested that they need to do is lower the rate that they've suggested. We've always said that a rate of between 3 and 5% paid for by the guests would be ideal, but we do think that it could be a great opportunity to contribute to social housing funding and social housing projects.
So 3 and 5% in New South Wales, do you think that would be about right? And why should the guests pay? Why shouldn't Airbnb absorb that cost?
So what we've seen around the world is that guests can pay a fee about the price of a cup of coffee. Most of them won't actually notice that particular fee, and then that money can be used for contributions towards social housing projects, which can actually then help meaningfully solve the housing challenges that we're seeing in different parts of the world.
No, I understand the concept of the levy, but why wouldn't Airbnb pay it? Why do you have to pass that on? If it's, as you say, the price of a cup of coffee, you wouldn't even notice.
Well, the other thing that we've also said that could be used is a registration fee change. We think that there's different ways that hosts, the people who actually own the properties, could be contributing to the housing challenges that we're seeing around the state at the moment. We think that there could be a way of structuring the registration fees that apply. We want to make sure that existing registration fees remain low for people who are renting out a private room or renting out their own home. But when we're actually looking at people who are renting out their properties around the clock, around the course of the year, we think there could be an opportunity for actually those registration fees being appropriately structured so that they're contributing to the compliance and enforcement of the existing rules which apply to the short-term rental.
I mean, when Airbnb says, oh, look, we're all for a levy, but you've got to put it on hotels as well, that really is a little backhanded, isn't it? Because the hotels already pay levies that Airbnb don't.
What Airbnb would be prepared to do is actually work on a levy just for the short-term rental sector if we can get some of the other settings right.
Yeah.
And that would include removing the existing cap restrictions which apply around some areas of the state. We note that the government's own discussion paper actually notes that cap arrangements, that is restrictions on the number of nights you can use a property for short-term rental, the government's own discussion paper has actually said that those particular caps actually increase the underutilisation, the underuse of properties for short-term rental. And that makes sense because it's actually just an arbitrary restriction on property which may not be available to be put onto the long-term rental market.
Yeah, but I understand that, Michael, but why would hotels have a levy like Airbnb does? The whole point of this is that Airbnbs are taking up those that could be rented out for long-term rentals. Hotels aren't doing the same thing there.
Well, I think it's important to remember that there are a number of properties that are on the short-term rental market that have never been on the long-term rental market and will never be available.
What's the percentage in your view?
Well, what we do know is that New South Wales, there's about 1% of overall housing stock which is being used in short-term rentals. And one thing that we have said during the submission process is that there could be an opportunity for the existing registration scheme to collect data around how many properties somebody's own primary own home, how many properties are a holiday home. We think that there could be a great opportunity to actually get more transparency about the data which applies to the short-term rental sector.
Sure, but what about my question about why you want this levy to be on hotels? They're very different things, aren't you? Do you accept that?
As I said, we'd be open to working with the government on a short-term rental levy if we can get the other settings right, including making sure that other restrictions on the
Yeah.
short-term rental sector were removed and ensuring that the rate of the levy was at an appropriately low rate.
Okay, so I think you're talking about the restrictions that have been imposed in Byron Bay because they have an acute rental crisis there. Because essentially, people can make way more money off short-term Airbnb rentals, and what that was creating is there was no affordable accommodation for anyone who wanted to work in the town. So it was causing a lot of social issues there. Are you aware of that?
We're certainly aware that Byron is a very unique example, and when the unique rules were brought in by the planning minister last year, he did note that Byron is a very unique market.
Yeah.
So it's important to remember there are existing rules that apply across the state. There is registration, there is a code of conduct, and there is a cap that applies across the greater Sydney metro area and a couple of other key councils. And what we said is that the other arrangements, including the cap, could be looked at. If we want to bring in a levy, which we would be happy to work with the government to bring in.
What are you saying here? Can we just get a little bit? I just want to deal with the between the lines stuff here. So are you saying that you could accept these caps if the levy was between 3 or 5%, but if it's higher than that, you want the caps? So there's a quid pro quo here.
We think that a levy would be much more effective at dealing with the housing crisis than a cap. Cap arrangements around the world have been proven to be quite ineffective at dealing with the housing crisis, but we do think that a levy arrangement could effectively provide a pool of extra revenue for the government to build new housing.
Well, to be fair, Michael, I'm not quite kind of following what you're saying. If you're saying the levy, would be equivalent to a cup of coffee, that's not going to change the market, whereas a cap does. So it can't be both things, if you know what I mean.
The levy would collect revenue over time, which would be creating quite a good revenue.
But the housing crisis now, so do you accept that there does need to be caps in some areas, like Byron Bay being that unique example, as you put it?
What we'd like to do is work with the government on local responses to where those areas, like Byron, where there's a very unique set of circumstances. But it's important to remember that the caps that have been in place for a while now have not solved housing challenges around the state. And what we've seen from around the world, examples from around the world, is that caps remain a fairly ineffective way of dealing with the housing pressures. And as the government's own discussion paper noted, it actually increases the underuse of properties. It actually means that more will sit empty throughout the course of the year.
So do you have a solution to this housing crisis then from where you sit? Because you have a pretty unique perspective.
Well, we think that a levy would be a great way to actually create.
But again, that's long term. That's short term. I mean, you're saying caps don't work, but what are the other options?
Well, the levy would be a longer-term solution to actually responding to the supply challenge. And we've worked with Urbis, major urban planning firm Urbis, and they've actually noted through their research that short-term rentals, there's not a strong correlation between short-term rentals and the broader housing challenges that we're seeing. So what we want to actually be doing is working with the government to actually get the balance right of the housing sector. There is a lot at stake here. Airbnb guests contributed about $4 billion in guest spending to the state's economy last year, and that supported about 28,000 jobs. So we want to make sure that the contributions to the visitor economy can remain in place and that the rules and regulations for the short-term sector are fit for purpose.
I understand that. If I could just ask you one more question, though, is that, I mean, I know you've got all these research and that's well and good, but when you go onto looking at an area like Bondi, for example, when you go and find a long-term rental, there is about 10% available of what's compared to what is on Airbnb for short-term rentals. Surely you can see that there's a problem there.
Well, I think that the example you're looking at there wouldn't actually take into account the number of properties that are already rented out in those locations, which already have a tenant living in them, which already have a bond arrangement in place. It's important to remember that not every property which is on a short-term rental platform is necessarily available to be put into the long-term rental market. It might be a holiday home. It might be somebody's second home. It actually be someone's own primary place of residence they put up onto our platform when they're not using it themselves. So again, we want to make sure that the regulations are fair. Airbnb does support regulations of the short-term rental sector. We want to work with the government to get that right.
Michael, we really appreciate your time this morning. It's an important issue. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks a lot.